I know you've got an ear out for the start of the podcast, but before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to remind you to keep an eye out for Darrell Lee's limited edition Christmas treats, because they're in stores now. Like the iconic Christmas nougat pudding, so yummy and a gorgeous little gift. And some delicious Chrissy-themed twists on your favourite treats, like the Darrell Lee Rockley Road with chewy red and green jelly pieces, green and red crunchy milk chocolate balls, my favourites, and green apple and strawberry flavoured licorice. Watch them disappear. Your Christmas treats table will pop with colour and scrumptiousness. Spread some joy, bring the fun, and enjoy the Christmas tradition that is Darrell Lee. Hurry before they sell out. Darrell Lee makes Christmas better. This is The Five of My Life with me, Nigel Marsh. The series where I talk to notable people about 5 of their defining things. The way it works is my guests always choose a favourite film, book, song, place and possession. They tell me their choices in advance so I can research them, but they don't tell me why they've chosen them. That's the subject of our conversation. The reason I devised this series is I wanted to create a slightly different way to gain an insight into the real lives and thoughts of prominent people. Chris Mitchell has had a remarkable career in the media spanning 5 decades. News Corporation's longest-serving editor worldwide, he's most commonly known for his highly successful 13-year stint as the editor-in-chief of the Australian newspaper. Made an Officer of the Order of Australia for his service to Indigenous education programs, journalism and media, Chris has had a unique vantage point and impact on the issues facing Australia in the 21st century. The movie that you've chosen, I am so grateful to you because I adore it. I'm a little bit of a obsessive fan of the film that you've chosen, which is the 1987 cult classic Withnail and I. So tell me about that, Chris.
Well, I guess it seems to me that it is a very amusing film, and the more you watch it, the more you see in it. I think the acting performances are fantastic, and Richard E. Grant particularly. I think Uncle Monty is a fabulous role, and I notice online many people say he should have got an Academy Award for it, a British Academy Award. But overall, I think he's captured that whole 1960s London thing very well. And I've got a lot of friends who, went through the whole, 68 period in London, and it seems to me that he's done a reasonably authentic job on it all.
Yeah, I adore it. The thing that's potentially surprising about that film is it's all true. Yeah. So Bruce Robinson, who wrote it, is the I in the film. Yeah. And Withnail is his real-life friend, Vivian, who was an alcoholic. I mean, it's actually, the real story is a tragedy. I mean, he died at the age of 45 injecting alcohol into his stomach because he couldn't, imbibe it quick enough and all that sort of stuff. But just an amazing film that stays with you. And beyond the comedy, it's a love story between those 2 blokes.
It is, and also how they feel about, the advances of Monty. So they're quite tolerant of him, even though they're scared of him. Also, I think some of the scenes, they do stick with you for a long time. Like I think procuring child's urine so that he can strap it to his leg in case he gets pulled over for DUI. It's hilarious, really. and the whole episode up in the countryside in Yorkshire is fabulous, yeah.
Just bring us the finest wines available to humanity. We want them here.
Some famous sayings around in that movie.
And I saw an interview with Richard E. Grant who says, to this day, will be walking down the street, he said, at least 2 times a week, and someone will lean out of a car window and shout, "Scrubbers!"
Also, I liked him in Wawa too, the South African film. I thought he was fabulous in that.
Yeah, and that that's his true story.
That's his real life.
I mean, his dad loading a gun and shooting at him, and if it had fired, he'd be dead.
Yeah, he's a marvellous actor, isn't he?
Absolutely. And he wasn't the original choice for that film. Yeah. So that just a fabulous thing. Another theme in Withnail is obviously the booze. But I wonder in the business and industry and sector that you've been in, how central or not a role booze played in the early days. Was it everyone getting tanked? I mean, I used to work in advertising in the 80s, so everyone was smashed at lunch every day. I mean, what was it like?
Look, Nigel, I was pretty surprised, especially in Sydney. So everybody in Brisbane, when I was a young journalist on the Telegraph up there, was they drink a lot after work, but it was an afternoon paper, so you'd work in the mornings and then go to the pub when the paper was out. The culture in Sydney when I moved down was amazing. So because the Journalist Club was so close to News Corp, they would always be at the journos, and the journos in those days only closed for Christmas lunch. So it was open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And you could tell, people would stumble out of there at midday and go home and have a sleep before they came back to work and started their shifts, 6 or 7 at night. And I was a bit taken aback by it. I remember one particular day in my first week here, the chief sub was standing at the bar in the journos with his schooner on the floor, and he'd connected all of the straws so that he could stand there and drink it. And I've never seen a senior executive on a newspaper behave like that. And later that same night, we were playing pool up on the top floor, and it's probably about 3 a.m, and my first week in the job. And one of the subs is in an argument with this chief sub, who I won't name, clocks him on the head with the 8-ball and knocks him out. And he's unconscious on the top floor of the journos. And that was my baptism into Sydney journalism. It's pretty amazing, really, yeah. So, but look, it's changed, and I think the young ones today are pretty serious. I don't think the booze culture really holds anymore, but it was unbelievable that some people could function.
We're going to stay with the autobiographical theme, because you, for your book, and I don't know if you're doing this just to make me like you, but you're choosing all my favourites. We are going back to the beginning of the last century, and you've chosen Somerset Maugham's masterpiece of human bondage, published in 1915. Tell us about that book and why you chose it.
Well, I came to Sydney to work initially on the Financial Review, and I met an Englishman there who was a very big fan of Maugham, and he introduced me to Maugham. And I guess the years before that, I'd been working in the day and studying at night, getting my university degree. So most of my reading had been about economics or history or politics. And, I then had a good job at the Fin and plenty of time to read for pleasure. And I got into Maugham. I think I started with The Moon and Sixpence, and I read The Razor's Edge and a lot of the short stories. But the one that really stayed in my mind was Of Human Bondage. And I thought the portrayal of Philip was heartfelt. Sort of almost had me on the first page. I think that whole scene, where he's taken down to kiss his mother goodbye and, he goes off to the grandmother. It's pretty heartrending sort of stuff. And Philip has an incredibly disappointing life. The allegory for his club foot, I think, is really affects Maugham and Maugham's stutter and Maugham's homosexuality and other things. But, he comes out the other end of the book with equanimity, I think. He learns to put life's disappointments in perspective. And particularly the disappointments he has with women. So I thought Mildred was a pretty shocking character, and maybe a bit of a pointer to Maugham's, difficult attitude to the sex. But I thought Philip came out of it as a kind of a heroic figure, and I think the book holds well. I noticed that I looked at it last night, and a lot of people are still rating it one of the top 50 books of all time. And I do remember back in the late 1980s doing a bit of a search about it, and it was still in the top 100 books of the 20th century in sales in the United States at that stage. So 60 years on, it was still selling.
Yeah, I mean, an undisputed masterpiece. Some of the early writing about religion is just astonishing. Tell me about your relationship to religion. Are you a religious chap?
I was raised a Catholic. It was reasonably tricky because my dad was Catholic, and sounds like a Maugham story actually, but he was going to be a priest, and he left the priesthood, or gave up his thoughts of the priesthood, to run off with my married refugee mother.
He chose a woman, not God.
He did, yeah.
or both, I should say, sorry.
So she was Lutheran, and I've only found out recently, working on a book about her life, that she was actually in the camp in Bonegilla with her husband. I'd always been told, or given to believe, that she had left Germany because this relationship had broken up. I didn't realise they'd come as a couple.
Right.
So she had to fess up to me. I did about 100 hours of interviews with her for this book. I think because Dad died early, Mum felt a duty to sort of raise us as Catholics, my sister and I. So she later that year she converted. So I went to a Sunday Mass at Easter and watched my mother being baptised in front of the entire community, which was a pretty unusual thing to do. And I guess I felt I got a good religious education while I was there, but I kind of abandoned it in adult life. And I haven't really been somebody who's practiced for more than 40 years.
Do you pray?
I don't really. I guess I feel attracted to a more humanist point of view. I did a lot of medieval studies in my undergraduate degree, and I read a lot about Christian mysticism, which I found fascinating, and I thought it shared a lot with mystical traditions in other religions. But it sort of struck me this absorption in the Godhead was a rather conceited attitude for a God to have. And I like the idea of karma and what goes around comes around. I like the idea of doing the right thing by your fellow man because your fellow man is your fellow man or fellow woman, rather than do it either because you're absorbed in your love of God or because you fear hell, all of which seem much less noble inspirations for rectitude, in my view.
And it's also quite comforting that the bastards get theirs eventually.
Indeed.
When the train comes, the karma train comes into town. One of the sad things about Morn's life is both his parents died before he was 10.
Yeah.
And please say nothing if it makes you uncomfortable, but your dad died when you were at 8, I think?
Yeah, just turned 8. And it was quite a tricky day and probably the overwhelming memory of my life. So we'd been staying up at Terrigal and, it was our first holiday in Sydney, so at the end of 1964. And they decided we'd go to Wiseman's Ferry for a picnic. And we got the ferry over from the north side and set up the picnic table outside the town and just on the bank. Anyway, he was swimming alone. He got into trouble. And my mum had to swim out to try and save him. But, she being of German extraction, she was not a strong swimmer. We never exactly knew why he got into trouble. He had a pretty bad motorcycle accident a couple of years earlier and might have damaged his heart doing that. I had to sort of stay on the bank, and my sister was quite hysterical, obviously, watching the whole scene. So they were only 15 metres offshore, yeah. So I didn't really ever go back there and ever sort of survey the scene until my mum was about 85. And I said, would you like to go and visit? And we did. And she was quite shocked, I think. My memory of it was pretty perfect because I was standing on the bank watching it all. But she was in the water, so her memory of it was a fast-flowing and difficult stream in which to operate. But in fact, it's almost the widest part of the Hawkesbury, and it's quite still the water there. We ended up having to overnight it at the police station. It took 4 days before they found his body, and so we went up and stayed with my aunt, my mother's sister in Brisbane, while they kept looking for Bob. And I think they found him on Christmas Day. Yeah, so it's all pretty shocking, really. Yeah.
Well, terrible story. And how, I mean, obviously you've built a very successful life and career, but how do you feel that informed the man that you became and are?
I think it's in a funny way. It's hard to compete with somebody who everybody thought was reasonably saintly. So most of my dad's friends did regard him as somebody who should have become a priest. He was very heavily into philosophy. He spoke a lot of strange languages like Aramaic and Gaelic and Russian and German, and so he spoke 11 languages. I think for a young man growing up in Brisbane, you can't compete with somebody who all of your relatives and all of his friends think of in those terms. And of course, he never lived long enough to face life's disappointments. So at some level, I kind of just decided to go my own way. I think my wider family were disappointed that I chose journalism. I was under a lot of pressure to pick either medicine or dentistry, and I didn't really appeal to me at all. I think in hindsight, it all worked pretty well. I think my mum did a good job. She was the one who suggested trying out for a newspaper, and I think it was probably the job I was made for, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, your first three choices, I've just adored researching you and your choices, Chris. You are sticking with the autobiographical theme, but also there's a theme of love, because Within Ellen and I is about love between two best friends, of human bondage, the Mildred story that you mentioned, unrequited love, and the choice that you have for your song, Love Will Tear Us Apart, Joy Division 1980, written by Ian Curtis, about decaying love. He, as a 19-year-old chap, got married at 18 to Deborah. He wrote that song at 23 about his failing marriage to Deborah. And 3 weeks after he wrote it, he topped himself.
That's right.
Poor bastard.
He was only a single after he was dead.
It was released 4 weeks after he... Yeah. So tell us why you've chosen that song.
Well, for a start, it was one of the earliest records I ever reviewed as a young record reviewer, and I loved it.
You reviewed it?
Yeah, I reviewed it. And,
can you remember what you said?
I think initially I reviewed the album Closer, and then I wrote about the song. But look, I suppose I'd always loved the Doors, and Ian's voice always reminded me of Jim's voice. I thought the Doors had an ability to take pop music to another level. You know, they weren't just rock and roll. I love the Stones, I love the Beatles, still listen to Elvis Presley, and I love a lot of modern bands too. But I guess it struck me that Morrison wrote at a whole other level from, Mick and Keith or, any of the Beatles. And I think they did too, Joy Division. I think, obviously I thought the New Order band was a terrific dance development. I loved a lot of the early singles, but they didn't have that rawness of emotion or indeed that voice. They didn't have Curtis's voice. And I think to me, in 1980, he sounded a lot like as if Jim Morrison had come back.
So it's fascinating hearing you talk about the quality of writing. So here is a 23-year-old man, and I'm just going to read out a few of the lyrics. Yeah. And he's in serious pain because it's falling to pieces with Deborah. And in that song that most people would just know the chorus, love will tear us apart again, fabulous and whatever else. But in the verses, he has written, as a 23-year-old, when routine bites hard and resentment rides high, yet there's still this appeal, all my failings exposed, something so good, just can't function no more.
Very raw, isn't it?
As a tribute to I have to ask, it is the perfect segue because you are a man who has form when it comes to just a couple of marriages in your back pocket. So could you chat to me about the challenges and how you face them of being a very successful in a very stressful job and being a dad and maintaining or not a sort of long-term romantic relationship?
Look, I'm very lucky that that my ex-wives were so patient with my career. When I spoke earlier about when I first arrived in Sydney, one of the things that struck me was how many of the people on the old Daily Telegraph had multiple marriages. And I always used to say, well, that's not going to happen to me. But, a newspaper, especially when you're running it, it is a very, very demanding mistress. And, as you would be aware from reading it, I really did throw myself into it. So it was my every waking hour, sometimes from 6 a.m. till well after midnight. And as digital journalism came in and we all went to 24-hour publishing, I found I didn't really have time to myself on Saturdays either. I'd always gone online to check the paper on Sunday afternoons, and probably my first 15 years as an editor, I went in every Sunday as well. But I think for a wife to put up with a husband doing, it's a bit like being in politics. I think it's almost an all-encompassing job. And it's got great rewards, and it's terrific fun if you like the business, and I do. But I've maintained a good relationship with my exes, and because I've got kids from two different wives, the four of them are good friends. My present wife, Kathy, has 4 kids of her own too. So the 8 of our joint family all get on well together. We've got sort of 3 holiday houses where I have my holidays, and that's because sometimes we need them for all of the kids and grandkids to come.
Right.
I think my Deborah has been a terrific mum to my older kids, and Christine is now with Peter Grester, and they live in Brisbane. Peter's a wonderful sort of stepfather to my boys, and I think they're better off for having him in their lives. I get on very well with Peter. But really, everything's pretty positive with the two. And I'm sometimes surprised that people can have children and 20 or 30 years with somebody and then all of a sudden they don't speak. What does that say about your time together? And I guess going back to the song, even though, there's suggestions that he was seeing another woman at the time, the Belgian producer, he writes with great love of his child and his wife. Yeah.
So, that's an amazing story and an amazing achievement to have those blended Christmases with all those people. It's something that I've noticed, and I'd be fascinated on your perspective, Chris, is I increasingly feel that people can't deal with nuance. That they, it has to be, a marriage breaks up, therefore I hate him or I hate her, or whatever it is, talking about Brexit, climate change, whatever it is, you go, I don't want a nuanced, well, you've just given a wonderful, loving, true, authentic description of your marriages that's not black and white.
Yeah.
It feels real.
Yeah.
But I get a sense that that's not good copy.
Yeah.
If I was doing this podcast in another forum, I go, no, mate, can we do that again? I want you to say I hate the bitch or whatever. Have you noticed the quality of public debate getting worse, or is that just me?
I think it's getting much worse, yeah, and I do think it is social media. I think complexity doesn't sit easily with 140 characters. My sort of favourite book on this whole area of grey areas is Primo Levi, and Primo talks about the grey zone. I think a lot of complex issues in life are quite grey, and it's quite a dark, thing that Primo Levi writes about. But the complicity between, some people in the Holocaust and their guards is, only someone like he could have written about it. My older kids' mum is Jewish, and my son with her has decided not to take that seriously. But my daughter lives in Tel Aviv and has made her Aliyah and loves being Jewish. So, in a way, I've sort of taken the view on a whole lot of things when I write about this in my column that, it is important that people, especially people in positions of power in the media, understand that you're not a deplorable just because you voted for Donald Trump, or you're not a mad lefty just because you voted for Hillary Clinton. And it seems to me, there's a lot of what happens in debate in our country and really in the Anglosphere forgets about politics as well. I was lucky enough to study at Oxford for a little while about the EU back in the late 90s. It was a British government scholarship. And I came away thinking, this is a funny place because nobody I speak to likes the EU, but everybody in academia thinks it's important because they think there'll be another world war in Europe. And I remember saying to various German and French professors, but you guys won't be powerful. No one will care. These are little countries in Europe. Big wars will start with countries like China and India, And it struck me at the time that the EU was really a legacy of the 20th century. And I'm not surprised that that ordinary Brits are quite divided about it. I think if you live around the city of London and you're one of the big beneficiaries of global trade, it makes a lot of sense to you. But if you live out in the country, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. I've spent a fair bit of time in Greece and Portugal recently. I understand why the Greeks hate it. If I want to buy good, cheap clothes, I can get them the same things at a better price in Berlin than I can in Athens. Now, people in Athens don't have high wages, but the euro is costing them a lot in living standards. So as somebody who's done a bit of economics, I'd say what they should do is abandon the euro, go back to the drachma, have a massive devaluation, make themselves a much more attractive destination for even more tourism. Now, obviously the central bank understands that they do depend on money from Germany and the EU. But what's in it for France and Germany? Well, those countries get markets. So why are there so many Mercedes taxis in Athens? It's because of the EU, and they're all using the same currency. So it's really the French and the Germans, making sure they've always got a market for those successful products that they've been selling.
So what you do and what you've just done then is fascinating to me in terms of being a good journalist and a good editor, because you have a deep understanding of different sides of the issue, and it's complex, and it's the grey zone that Primo writes about. I have to compliment you on your writing since I've been in the country on Indigenous affairs. You obviously deeply care about it, but you don't take a 140 characters view of it. You write deeply, knowledgeably about it. Would you mind telling us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think probably because I spent a bit of time living in North Queensland and working up there, and also when I was a younger man, I played football regularly against teams from Boys Town and other parts of the world where you met lots of Aboriginal kids. I suppose I've always felt quite keenly that walk a mile in another man's shoes thing. I've seen friends who had Aboriginal girlfriends be taunted by their own family for that. One of my closest friends in the world is Nicholas Rothwell, who lives with Alison Anderson, the former Aboriginal Affairs Minister from Darwin. Very happy together. But Alison is probably the senior woman from the Northern Territory. She's probably the last, woman who really carries weight in tribal Northern Territory lands. And she says the whole place is falling apart. The lack of that kind of traditional family authority that did used to keep those places like Yuendamu together is telling very hard on those societies. I mean, I think one of the related points, that I think it's the same reason you and I are interested in AIEF, the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation. I think it's clear that people like Alison, who are educated, get more control over their lives. So, you're just buffeted about by the winds of fortune if you don't have the power of education. So I like being involved in something that does take kids who are bright and does lift them up. I'm a bit contemptuous of people on the left, some of whom are good friends of mine, who criticise me for my involvement in this, and they think I'm cherry-picking the best kids from communities. And I just don't see it that way at all. I think, even if they never go back to their old community, at least you're giving them a chance. But actually some do go back. There are people like Noel Pearson who do go back, and they do spend their lives working to lift those communities. And it's always struck me as, a big flaw in our country that, we can talk about this. I've been talking about it as a journalist for nearly 50 years, and I don't see much improvement. I think Kevin Rudd did the right thing, and he applied metrics after his apology. And we try to have these closing the gap statements every year, but actually the gap isn't closing. And particularly for remote Aboriginal people who I see when I go up to far north Queensland or the Territory, life is still very, very difficult. And it shouldn't be. People like, Warren Mundine talk about how much money is being spent on it. But my sort of feeling as a newspaper editor is too often that money was wasted on white bureaucrats. A lot of the money that was really earmarked by the feds to support Aboriginals in the Northern Territory did go on Darwin public servants rather than building houses out in the Alice or in Yuendamu or other communities. So it does strike me that we do need to apply some pretty hardcore rational thinking to how we try to address all of this. And it moves, doesn't it? So back in the 90s it was all about self-empowerment and, we'll let these people make decisions for themselves. And, then that was seen to have not worked. And, we dismantled all of that. And we went to the responsibility and rights agenda of Noel Pearson. And then now that's being dismantled again. And now everybody's on about, a voice to Parliament. I personally do support a voice to Parliament, but at another level, I've said to Noel many times, I probably actually support more the idea of dedicated seats based on population and geography. Now, you get yourself into an area a bit like mixed member representation in New Zealand. But it does strike me people on the right when they say, well, you've got Linda Burney or Ken Wyatt. Linda Burney and Ken Wyatt don't really represent Aboriginal electorates. They may be part Aboriginal people, and there may be some Aboriginal people in their electorates, but their electorates are overwhelmingly white middle-class electorates. Whereas you can look at areas in the north of Western Australia or Cape York or the centre or the Pitlands where you think you could actually throw up terrific local representatives, really smart people who live in those areas, and they could actually focus on doing things in the parliament that benefits those people. But while ever those people are carved off into other electorates, be it, Warren Inch's electorate or Bob Katter's electorate, they're not really going to focus on the betterment of Aboriginal people in those places. So my own view would be even better than a voice to Parliament would be dedicated seats.
Your fourth choice. We are coming back from England and Ian Curtis, and we are going up the New South Wales coast to Camden Head. I suspect it's where you might have a holiday property for all those wives and kids, but describe it and tell me why you've chosen it.
So it's about 30 kilometres south of Port Macquarie. It's an unusual sort of area in that we've got a large lagoon behind us to the west and a river slightly to the north that flows into the beach right below where we live, and a very large mountain the other side of the river and lagoon, and it's called North Brother. There's three brothers in Aboriginal legend, and they range from Taree through to Laurelton. So Laurelton, the local town, sits at the very bottom of North Brother, which is the three biggest of these mountains. Either side of there's that lake that goes out to the coast, but there's also very large lakes to the north and south of North Brother. One's sort of fed by the Manning, and the other feeds into the Camden Haven River. So one's called Queen's Lake, and it has its own sailing club on it, and on the south side is Watson Taylor Lake. So this mountain is almost swimming in this vast sea of lakes and rivers. The beach immediately below me is a pretty wild north-facing surf beach, but on the other side of the peninsula, maybe 200 yards walk is a open south-facing beach. So you get a good swell on.
Sounds heavenly.
Yeah, it's look at what it reminds me of, and what people say when they come and see it. It's sort of a bit like Yamba or Noosa were many years ago. So the same sort of geography with the big river and different beaches and different breaks. Where Camden Head is, there's 88 houses, no retail at all, so there's no shop. You have to drive into either Dunbogan or Laurelton to buy paper or get milk or anything like that. But it also means nobody comes there to buy anything. So, it's completely enclosed by National Park, and unless you're going there for a swim or a fish, you wouldn't go there.
And is that where you have family Christmases or?
Usually I do, yeah. So my sister lives on a farm west of there in the Lawn Valley, and my mum's in care in Port Macquarie, it's about 30 k's north. So all these years later, we've ended up fairly close to each other.
I have to ask, how did Mum and your editorial policy, whatever else, go? Was she just a that's my son, go Chris? Or did she ever call you up and say, how dare you say that about that nice man?
Well, being Mum was in Hamburg during the war, so she's very sort of affected by that. So when we were kids, if there was, the Saturday afternoon war movie with Audie Murphy or John Wayne, Mum would have to leave in tears. She couldn't hear the air raid sign. So she was upset that I supported the Iraq War. But I guess a lot of people were. Overall, I think her politics has moved to the right. She was quite a lefty, used to march against the Vietnam War, but often her leftism is about war. So she's quite hostile to anybody who she thinks is going to kill, violently. And I think that makes sense. So her brother was 17 when he was drafted, at the end of the war in early 1945. He made it to the Russian front and was taken prisoner 6 weeks into his military career, and ended up in Siberia for 6 years. And when he got back to Germany, he had tuberculosis and was in hospital for 2. So they were a family that were kind of pretty poorly affected by the war. Her father had a war relationship on the other side of the wall, and there was a daughter who ended up not meeting my mother and her siblings until after the wall came down. And then one of her sisters was a nurse and married a freedom fighter from Romania who'd lost his legs under a Russian tank. So it's one of those really Central European stories that you can understand why they're not keen on any more wars. Hence the EU.
Yeah, and also, if you are intimately affected by those events, you can understand why you might take against people writing about them who haven't been.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I think that's right. Yeah.
So we're coming on to your fifth and final choice, which is your possession. And you've chosen your house in Manly.
It's not a fancy house. It's just a sort of 3-story townhouse, really, not much land. But for me, I'm not really big on possessions, so I've been pretty good at upping stumps and leaving, as you alluded to earlier. And I'm not really big on collecting things, and I'm not big on watches or cars or anything like that. But I'm very happy there, So when I had to think hard about this, like what possession am I going to say, and that's the only one I could really think of. So for me, I'm quite content living between Camden Head and Manly. It's I've got north-facing views all the way up to the Central Coast. I've got a lot of Aboriginal art on the walls. Some of it given to me by Rupert, which I'm very pleased with. Some I bought myself. Kath and I do go and to the beach a lot. And I surf, and we do that walk along from Ferry Bower twice a day, every day. So when I'm not at Camden Head, I find I don't take my car out for weeks at a time. We walk everywhere we go. Even if I'm coming in to see you for a podcast, I walk to the ferry. So
now, you mentioned Rupert. Now, this is not Rupert the bear. I imagine this is another Rupert. Can you tell me about him? And are you still mates? I mean, how does that all work?
Well, I haven't spoken to him, since I retired. But I'm sure if I wrote to him, he'd respond. But look, I found Rupert, a very interesting fellow to work for, and probably not much like his public image at all. Rupert's a little bit shy, personally. I think, even though he's portrayed these days as some mad right-wing ideologue, he's supported lots of Labor leaders, and he's quite close to Hawke and Keating. He's obviously quite close to Tony Blair. I think Rupert's quite capable of supporting, what he thinks is good for a country at a time. He's still an Australian patriot, so I think he's always been criticised for taking American citizenship, but like most of his big decisions, that was business. But I know, for instance, he did a lot of work on the free trade agreement with the United States. He's always heavily involved in G'day USA. He still owns his farm, out near Canberra at Yass. I've been to the farm with him, and the first morning he gets up and he walks to the nearest mountain as hard as he can. He knows all the local drovers by name. He goes drinking with them. I think he's got a great deal of affection for this country. And if he's got a place in Carmel in Northern California, which looks for all the world like it could be in Yass. The vegetation's exactly the same. And I think he's not showy in his personal tastes. If the houses are all reasonably modest, they're not huge glamorous compounds. So, and I think Rupert is an inveterate gossip. He loves society with journalists. He likes talking to Paul Kelly about what's happening in politics, but he also likes talking to all the gossip columnists about, the latest scandals in the media or in entertainment, So I think he's quite an unusual guy. So I think Rupert's somebody who can leave the past behind and live for today. Always hungry for knowledge. For years, he sent me the latest books that he thought were fantastic. He'd just package them up and send me copies. So always interested in meeting new people. I think very unusual person. And even though he's got caught up in this highly partisan world that we all now live in, I think probably a great Australian, really. It's an amazing life story to have got that little paper in Adelaide when he was only, still at university in the UK, and come back and turn that into a global behemoth is pretty amazing.
So whatever one might think of him, has got an astonishing legacy, which makes me want to ask you is, what would you like your legacy to be when you are pushing up daisies in hopefully 60 years' time? What do you want people to say behind your back?
Look, I'd like to have thought that I left the paper, the Oz, in a good condition, and I left it in a better condition than I found it. I'd like people to think that I was good to my family and good to my kids. Despite the shocking hours, I tried to, take my older kids to sport every weekend, and I was quite devastated when at 15 Jake said, "I don't think you need to come to cricket anymore. You're the only dad still coming." And I thought, what am I going to do on Saturdays now? So I've found retirement good. A lot of people said, "Oh, you'll miss the paper," but I felt I'd had enough. It was nearly 25 years as a daily editor. It's a very long time to do a job like that. And I still like doing my column about the media. It's contained. It doesn't take a huge amount of time, but it encourages me to keep following the media. My son, Jake, bought me golf lessons, so I've started playing golf, and I probably play 3 times a week now. I really love it. Just come back from a couple of days up in Bonneville, the hardest course I could imagine, and played 36 holes there in 2 days, and it was a devastatingly hard course. But, I still go to the beach and I still surf a lot, and I've found renewed pleasure, as I did in my 20s when I discovered Somerset Maugham, in reading for fun again. So I'm reading a book a week now, and I'm big books, and they're not about politics, most of them, which is good.
It's so wonderful to have had this conversation. You've been so open and warm and non-defensive. I can't thank you enough, Chris. The last traditional question is always, which is difficult for you because you've met bloody everybody, but is, who would you like to hear on 5 of My Life next, and why?
Well, okay, can I answer that in 2 different ways?
Well, we'll let you.
Look, one of the most impressive people I ever met was Yitzhak Rabin, but you can't have him because he's dead. But I went to a function in Israel, and we weren't really meant to be there. Richard Palfreyman, who was doing The World Today, and I escaped our Israeli minders and broke through a blockade and got into this function. And when he found out what we'd done, he spent an hour with us, smoking cigarettes and drinking and talking in that incredible, deep bass baritone Israeli voice. And he's a guy who I thought of as a genuine hero. He'd defended the West Gate of the old city in 1948, and he'd stood on the first tank when they charged up the Golan Heights in 1967. He defeated Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1957, and yet he was assassinated by a right-wing Jewish nutter. But I thought one of the great liars of anyone I'd ever met. So he would have made a fantastic podcast. I think probably my closest friend in the business is still Paul Kelly.
Right.
So Paul is godfather of one of my kids. And, I think Paul's probably the smartest individual I know. A lot of politicians, when I was the editor-in-chief of the paper, would always consult Paul before they decided to announce anything. And I was quite intrigued how many people of both sides of politics bounced their ideas off him. And he's managed to, unlike a lot of people in this highly partisan media age, he's managed to maintain friendships on both sides. So it's probably a fairly dour choice, but I'd say Paul Kelly.
I love it. Chris Mitchell, thank you so much for sharing your 5 choices on the 5 of My Life.
Thank you for having me.
The 5 of My Life was presented by me, Nigel Marsh. Producer, Alex Mitchell. Sound production and theme music by Darcy Thompson and Matt Nicholish.